Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 6 different neutral cards usable by any and every faction that were included within the core set. In this video, I'm only going to be assessing and discussing the card combinations and synergy present inside the core set itself, but in later videos I'll be reviewing each and every one of this game's released and upcoming war packs and deluxe expansions. Although the cards discussed in this video can be used by a player of any of the game's base 7 factions, I'll nevertheless touch on any faction-specific synergy when appropriate. Although I'm sure to miss some uses for these cards throughout the course of this video, be sure to mention your personal favorites in the comments below. But with that said, let's get things started with a pair of neutral army units. First up, we have the nearly identical Rogue Trader and Void Pirate. Both of these units cost but a single resource token, they each have a command icon, 0 attack value, and a single hit point. They have the ally trait, and whereas the Rogue Trader confers a +1 resource bonus to whatever planet it happens to be present at, alternatively, the Void Pirate instead boosts that planet's printed card bonus by 1. So, abundantly clear upon initial assessment of these cards is that they very much help form the command phase foundation of each of the 7 different factions we see present within the core set. They're definitely not doing much inside of the combat phase given their printed 0 attack value and that pool of no more than a single hit point, but they're nevertheless designed to hopefully win you command struggles early and often, and entirely dependent upon the unique strengths and weaknesses of your deck, whether or not you choose to run both or only one of these allies, and however many copies you ultimately choose to include is going to be entirely dependent upon you. Specifically, if you're running a very resource-dependent, expensive, perhaps late-game style deck, you may very well prefer the Rogue Trader, just so you can try to accumulate as much wealth as possible to afford more individual, expensive, albeit powerful and formidable army units, but all the same, so long as you've got a healthy influx of cards, additional resources is exactly what's going to allow you to put as many of those into play as you possibly can. So even if you're running a low-cost swarm deck, so long as you don't find yourself stalling and running out of cards, I think it's going to be exceptionally uncommon to find any player that dismisses the potential opportunity for additional income. But, as with almost each and every card game on the planet, having more cards is almost never a bad thing, and for that reason, Void Pirate is probably even more respected and in even greater demand than its Rogue Trader brother, simply because the more cards that you're drawing during the command phase, that not only gives you all the more options for units to deploy during your subsequent round's deploy phase, but it also has the potential of drawing you attachments. And, seeing as how combat occurs right after command, the more events that you're drawing that you could potentially use to catastrophic effect in leveraging against your opponent, the better. And, of course, the possibility of drawing additional shield cards is always a welcome thing, just because the more you can do to keep any and all of your units alive, the more subsequent command struggles you're going to ultimately win, and the more combats you're going to walk away from with a much more favorable game state than you may have been looking at prior to going into it in the first place. Granted, we have seen some units within the core set that put these units to shame in a strictly command struggle type sense, but these nevertheless do have their own unique benefits. For instance, even an Eldar player, although they certainly have the option of playing one or more copies of the Bealtan Guardians, a one-cost army unit that nevertheless has double the command icon allotment of both the Rogue Trader and Void Pirate, that unit nevertheless confers neither a card nor resource bonus to its owner. So even though it might be more likely to win command struggles, ultimately the controller is all the less rewarded for doing so. So even in the face of that particular context, when it comes to deck construction, the Eldar player nevertheless does have some impetus, some compelling reason to consider including either of these neutral army units in their deck. And similarly, the Tau player has the limited 0 cost, 0 attack, single hit point, 2 command icon recon drones, which, even though once again it has double the number of command icons, and above and beyond that it costs no resources whatsoever, it too gives neither a card nor resource bonus. So even a Tau player has myriad reasons to consider either or both of these units for inclusion in their deck. And of course, even if you are opting to run either the Guardians or the Recon drones, you can certainly include up to 3 copies of that faction-specific unit, and one or both of these neutral army units as well. So certainly, I think it's entirely possible that either or both of these army units are going to be in direct competition with an attachment we're about to cover when it comes to your considering their deck inclusion, but by the simple merit of their being army units that you deploy onto the table, they nevertheless possess a number of inherent possibilities, both good and bad, that you can potentially leverage in your favor, or simply that you should be very aware of. For instance, seeing as how they have 0 attack and a single hit point, they're exceptionally vulnerable when it comes to being killed by your enemy's warlord, particularly during the first few rounds of the game, just because if they're deployed to a planet by their lonesome, it's entirely possible that your opponent's warlord may arrive having been committed to that planet and get one opportunity to attack prior to your having any chance at all to retreat. And seeing as how they only have a single hit point, it's nevertheless exceptionally likely that unless you're willing to start spending shield cards, they'll be quite handily destroyed. And if it just so happens that your opponent is running the likes of Captain Cato Sicarius, they might draw the additional benefit of not only depriving you of a resource and a card, and the possibility of your having won that command struggle, having gone otherwise uncontested, but they might generate an additional resource token for themselves through the merit of them blowing up your units. Or, if you're up against a Chaos player that has Zave's Split Tongue present at that planet, they may ultimately generate a Cultist token, so that they can either attack you with that at some point later in the game, or potentially sacrifice that token in order to put out one of their powerful, dangerous demon units into play for a single resource token less than they'd otherwise pay. And, of course, it goes without saying that for any unit with no more than a lone hit point, they're exceptionally easy to dispatch through any number of direct, indirect, or move damage type effects. Anything along the lines of Sicarius's Chosen to Orc Cannon can easily destroy these units, but so too can supports like Cracktooth Hall, or your opponent deploying a Weird Boy Maniac, or, much more likely if you happen to have multiple units at the same planet, your opponent opting to play a Warp Storm. In some respects, these units end up losing some of their utility if they happen to be swept up in your warlord's retinue, just because if they happen to move to a planet with your warlord, once you reveal your chosen planet during the command phase, at that point they're exhausted and they're no longer contributing their command icon, but All the same, if you do happen to be winning that command struggle, whether it's simply through your warlord being present at that planet or not, you nevertheless do have the option of gaining that card or resource bonus. You just have to keep in mind that when you do ultimately win a command struggle, it's up to you whether you collect all or none of that planet's printed resource or card bonus. And this +1 is in addition to that all or none type effect. So, under most circumstances, that's not really going to make any difference at all, unless perhaps you're trying to avoid your opponent playing Raid under any and all circumstances, or potentially if you're running the risk of getting close to drawing through your entire deck and start to run the risk of potentially losing the game if you ultimately do so. Still, beyond all the obvious downsides inherent to these units, in that they're ultimately rather frail, vulnerable, and often exposed to being sniped by your enemy warlord, they nevertheless possess a number of uses simply by the merit of their being army units as well. For instance, if you're running the event Suppressive Fire, they're a perfectly eligible target to exhaust in order to pick one of your opponent's non-warlord units at that planet to also exhaust as well. Or, if you just so happen to be running a deck that includes a large number of attachments, whether or not you can derive the additional benefit of surprising your opponents with those via ambush platform, the moment you boost their attack power up beyond their printed 0, you suddenly have the potential of dealing out damage your opponent may have been in no way anticipating or in any case prepared for. I think it's definitely worth making yourself as aware as possible of any devious tricks and surprises your deck could potentially use in conjunction with either of these neutral army units. Again, if you happen to be running the Astra Militarum, these are perfectly eligible targets for the receipt of the attack value boost from a Catachan outpost. And yet another situational use for these cards might be if you're using Tau, running up against a Dark Eldar player. If your opponent's affixed a copy of Suffering onto one of your more formidable, harder hitting, and more valuable army units, it's entirely possible that you might use the event Even the Odds in order to opportunistically and favorably shift that negative, aversive, penalizing attachment from your more valuable army units onto one of these neutral ones, because seeing as how they already have a printed 0 attack value, you're not only doing yourself no harm because that attachment can't lower it below 0, but you gain a small additional token benefit if that player happens to be allied with Chaos, that suddenly these otherwise frail, fragile, and vulnerable units may suddenly be immune to the likes of your opponent's Warp Storm. So, for all the different reasons I've already mentioned, and a great many more beside, these nevertheless quite clearly useful units do have a number of fantastic uses above and beyond drawing you additional cards and generating you additional resources, and as we see our card pool inevitably expand as more and more expansions are slowly but surely released over time, unless these are replaced entirely, I nevertheless think that they can help make a fantastic command phase foundation for any deck. The Void Pirate in particular continues to be very much a staple and auto-include type card for almost every faction to this day, and although they do amass additional weaknesses throughout our Warlord cycle of war packs, namely through their possessing the ally trait and, in a couple cases, actually being penalized for being forced to attack your opponent despite their 0 attack value, I nevertheless can't see these units going anywhere too soon. There seems to be very little reason indeed not to include at least one, if not both of these, in even present-day decks, and within the core set itself, if you're a very new player playing with a very limited card pool, I think it's hard to go too wrong even if you simply opt to auto-include 3 copies of each of these in almost each and every deck you build. So, whether you're sacrificing either of these units to your opponent's power from pain, or deploying them specifically to a command-valuable planet in attempt to spring some sort of clever and devious trap or trick upon your opponent, the options inherent to these inexpensive, affordable, and flexible cards are nearly limitless, and if in any case you're deciding to run either one or both of these units in your deck, I strongly encourage you to consider each and every possible option when it comes to deriving the absolute utmost value from these ostensibly command phase specific units. But, nevertheless, our next neutral card, and contender for command phase-centric deck inclusion, is the zero-cost Promotion. It has a single shield icon, the skill trait, and the limited keyword. It has the text attached to an army unit, and reads, "Attached unit gains 2 command icons." So, despite that deceptive 0 printed resource token requirement, this nevertheless does count as one of the 50 cards you are including in your deck, and is therefore not entirely free. And plus, it's definitely worth considering that it has that limited restriction, so that may or may not be a deterrent, depending largely upon your faction and how you opt to build your deck. Given our current card pool, it seems that Tau players in particular are going to be struggling with managing that limited keyword more so than any other faction. But nevertheless, this is a very powerful command phase focused card in that for a 0 resource cost, it gives any army unit you happen to have sitting on the table an additional, in many cases invaluable, 2 additional command icons. So even though this is counting as 1 card draw against you, its ability to almost assuredly pay for itself and then some, the same round that you deploy it, is all but assured. And, beyond its command phase use, if this happens to be one of those cards that you draw during the command phase, as the result of winning a command struggle, or it's simply a card that you've been holding on to, it nevertheless does have the inherent flexibility and versatility that any and all shield icon possessing cards happen to confer upon you, so that perhaps if the need is dire, or if it just so happens to be convenient or useful at the time, you can simply expend this card to gain the benefit of 1 shield, and potentially preserve or at least prolong the life of any of your units. So, as it can often compete with both of our aforementioned army units when it comes to space within your deck, it's definitely worth considering some of the inherent ups and downsides of Promotion simply by the merit of it being an attachment. So, specifically, its survivability and the likelihood of it being removed from play is entirely dependent on the hit points of whatever unit you ultimately opt to affix this to. So, if you happen to be attaching this to a very low hit point unit, something along the lines of an Incubus Warrior or Alpha Legion Infiltrator, although you do manage to derive some benefit from boosting up that command icon value, you nevertheless do run the risk of putting all of your eggs in one exceptionally fragile basket. And, while this doesn't actually generate you bonus cards and resources, it nevertheless is quite likely to allow you to win command struggles you simply would not otherwise, or, even if you just so happen to be breaking even with your opponent, at the very least, if you're not the player benefiting, you're nevertheless preventing your opponent from generating cards and resources of their own. Simply by merit of being an attachment, this has several built-in and intrinsic bonuses, namely conferring outright immunity to Warp Storm if you're concerned about your opponent leveraging that event against you, and, of course, through merit of this being attachment, there are going to be card-specific situational corner case uses for this as well. Things like the Fire Warrior Strike Team, which, of course, not only reap that command icon boost, but also derive the additional benefit of attacking ever so slightly harder during combat, in that they gain +1 attack value for each and every attachment of any kind that happens to be affixed to them. And in that case, if you are running a Tau deck, I think you're quite likely to also be running the likes of an Earthcast Technician or 3, and in that case, seeing as how this is an attachment and not an army unit in your deck, that unit's when enters play reaction can find a very much entirely eligible target through the likes of digging through the top of your deck and potentially finding one of your copies of Promotion. It's also definitely worth considering that this is not unique, but seeing as how it has that limited keyword, it does ultimately prevent you from playing perhaps your faction-specific army unit resource cost reduction support on the same turn that you play this attachment, or, if you're running the neutral support we've yet to cover Promethium Mine, both that support and this attachment are mutually restrictive of one another as well. But, all the same, I think it's definitely worth mentioning that limited cards are indeed exceptionally scarce, considering the entire contents of the full 6 war packs of the Warlord cycle of expansions. We only see an additional limited card, and if you don't happen to be playing the Tau, Eldar, or Space Marines, then it's as if to you that card does not at all exist. So, although it's entirely susceptible to being targeted by calculated strike, I think the likelihood of an opponent running that event, due to the relative scarcity of these limited cards, is exceptionally low indeed, and if you're very worried about the unit you adhere this attachment to maybe being returned to your hand through the likes of Deception, or perhaps destroyed outright through any number of damaging type events, supports, or abilities, then be sure to choose the safest and most appropriate target for this attachment. Something like an elite unit if you're worried about Deception, or in any case, some unit with a large number of hit points if it's simple damage that you're worried about. So, definitely some of the absolute best targets for this attachment include things like the entirely enemy event immune stalwart Ogren, or if you're worried about something like Archon's Terror routing one of your units and essentially negating those command icons, then maybe you're better off opting to adhere this to one of your unique army units. So, there's definitely a lot to like about this card. There are indeed a few pitfalls to be aware of, but seeing as how it costs no resources whatsoever, and for that reason you can wait until the absolute end of your deploy phase and use your very final deployment action in order to put this into play, you can almost guarantee that you're going to win the command struggle at whatever planet you ultimately choose to deploy this attachment to, or if you're simply looking to make an exceptionally appealing target for your opponent, this could very well play perfectly into all number of different devious tricks and surprises as well. So, taken all together, I think the 3 cards we've covered so far are all absolutely fantastic, each in their own right. They're each and every one deck staples for myriad different reasons, and seeing that our game's current meta very much rewards you for playing as many low-cost, cheap, inexpensive, affordable, but nevertheless effective units and attachments as possible, I think it's very hard to go wrong with including any of these cards. They're very much the bread and butter of a great many different decks, and I think they're certain to be staples, if not outright auto-includes, for months, if not years, of this game's lifespan to come. Next up, we have the one-cost neutral support, the Promethium Mine. It has the location trait, the limited keyword, and forced reaction. After this card enters play, place 4 resource tokens on it. And reaction. After the deploy phase begins, transfer 1 resource token from this card to your resource pool. So, strikingly similar to each and every one of the faction-specific supports that each serve to reduce the cost of any given army unit of that faction upon your choosing to deploy that unit, the Promethium Mine acts as a support in which you make an initial investment and nevertheless hope that the game runs enough rounds that ultimately you do end up seeing at least some profit, be it big or small. But, while you may first look at this card and think that you're investing a single resource in order to ultimately make a profit of 3, you nevertheless do have to take a number of different things into consideration. Specifically, this card happens to have that limited restriction, so if you're running those faction-specific army unit resource reduction supports, these two cards conflict in that you're only going to be able to pick and choose one of them to put into play during any given round of the game. And considering that you're more likely to see more benefit from these cards the earlier that you can play them, the fact that you might end up drawing one of those cards only to be ultimately disallowed from playing it can not only be frustrating, but it can also deprive you of the possibility of your having drawn a card that you could put into play and put into use immediately, whether it's an army unit that you can use to alter the conditions of the battlefield ever so slightly or dramatically more in your favor, or some other support that you could derive any number of benefits from, or even some sort of event that you could use to nastily surprise your opponent, or, at the very least, it could have been a shield card. The Promethium Mine has no shield icons whatsoever, and although it does not happen to be unique, something you certainly can't say about those faction-specific resource reducers, it nevertheless does have quite a few built-in limitations. And of the utmost importance to consider is that regardless of which of these limited cards I'm talking about you're deciding whether or not to include in your deck, they all take a fair bit of time before they ultimately start to pay off. For instance, taking a specific look at the Promethium Mine, you invest 1 resource, but you don't actually gain a resource until the following round. So, if the game were to end that turn, you're ultimately missing 1 resource token, and even if you value cards and resources on an approximately equal basis, which most of the time a single card is more valuable than a single resource, the Promethium Mine, counting as one of those cards in your deck, essentially doesn't start to pay off until the 3rd turn, once you've essentially generated 2 resources off of this card, so that it replaces the resource cost it initially incurred, and then provides you an additional resource for its counting as one of those cards in your deck. So, unfortunately, it isn't until you've pulled the 3rd resource off of this support that you really see any profit at all, and seeing as how that 3rd turn that you take a resource off of this will ultimately be the 4th turn that you've had this card in play, given the fact that games can last at most a grand total of 7 turns, and that it's entirely possible your opponent, particularly if they're playing orcs and have started to open up some of our Warlord Cycle of War packs, they may very well have the means of destroying this prior to your actually deriving any profit. Or, if it just so happens that the game concludes before you pull the 3rd or 4th resource token off of this card, then this investment is not paying off at all. At best, you're breaking even, and at worst, you're essentially wasting a card and resource. And plus, given the inconsistency with which you'll draw this when it's going to do the most good for you, probably in the early game so that you can accrue as many additional resources as possible, by merit of your running multiple copies, considering in particular that it has that limited keyword, it might not only prevent you from playing something like promotion or recon drones, but if you draw multiple copies, it could even conflict with itself. And by merit of your spending early game resources on a support like this that's very much a long-term investment that you're not going to see any benefit from anytime soon, you're nevertheless ever so slightly blunting the momentum you might otherwise gain if you'd have simply drawn instead some similarly cheap or inexpensive other card that may very well have helped you to gain some economic advantage in a more traditional sense. Something along the lines of a Void Pirate or Rogue Trader that we already covered in this very video, or something like a Bealtan Guardians if it just so happens that you're playing Eldar. But certainly the options do not end there. If you're a Chaos player, a Splintered Path Acolyte not only counts as a body on the field, it not only has a command icon with associated attack value where you could benefit not only from potentially winning command struggles, but you could also gain some combat benefit as well. And seeing as how even the most paltry of planets at the very least generate you a single card or a resource if you happen to win a command struggle there, through conventional means, through simply investing the single resource you'd have spent on a Promethium Mine in some equivalently costed early game army unit, even though your opponent has the opportunity of killing off that unit, I think you're much more likely to ultimately see some modicum of profit. For instance, several planets we've seen have the benefit of drawing you an additional card and granting you a bonus resource when you happen to win a command struggle there, and if that single resource token you choose to spend is simply invested in an army unit, then that card has already effectively paid for itself, whereas the Promethium Mine, you don't end up seeing that same benefit until it's been on the table turn after turn after turn. So, beyond everything I've already mentioned, I also think it's a damn shame that with the Promethium Mine, you don't even see a profit as quickly as you do with those faction-specific supports that each reduce the cost required to deploy army units, simply because at least with those, you're reducing resources each and every round, so there's no limit to the number of times that you can benefit from that effect throughout a given game, beyond you're simply having to exhaust that support. So even though there's essentially a built-in limitation to once per round, if you can ready the support, then you could very well benefit from it twice. And considering that you can also benefit from that cost reduction on the same turn that you play that support, something that certainly cannot be said of Promethium Mine, the existence of those cards, although they are unique, only serve to make this neutral support even less appealing than it already is. So, certainly there are some benefits to having additional supports on the battlefield. Perhaps if you're an Astra Militarum player running the likes of an infantry conscripts, this is going to confer yet another +2 attack value bonus to that unit, but simply by it sitting on the table, simply because it counts as limited, it's nevertheless an entirely eligible target for your opponent's Squig Bombin or Calculated Strike, or, as our card pool ever expands, any number of different card effects we've yet to see released, or we've simply yet to cover in this series. So, considering all of this card's built-in limitations, keeping in mind just how long it can take before you see any profit at all from any copies of this support you decide to play, in a card game that can last a grand total of a maximum of 7 rounds, I just cannot see, under almost any circumstance, a Promethium Mine ever being worth including in your deck. So, certainly your mileage may vary, but unless we start to see some powerful and enormously synergistic cards released to complement this location, I just cannot see myself including this card in any deck over almost anything else anytime soon. But in any case, next up we have a pair of neutral events, the first of which is the 1-cost Fall Back, with 1 shield icon, the Tactic trait, and reaction. After an elite unit is destroyed, put it into play from your discard pile at your HQ. So, being able to bring any single elite unit back to life after its death, destruction, and subsequent discard for the cost of a lone resource token, to me seems like an absolutely stellar effect and enormous savings, considering that something like the enormously expensive 8-cost Black Legion Helldrake could, for the mere cost of a single resource and single card in your deck, be returned to play, albeit at your HQ, seems potentially fantastic. So that if it just so happens that you are opting to make use of those powerful, formidable, resilient, deadly, and dangerous elite units, you can nevertheless guarantee that they're going to do as much for you as they possibly can in a command and combat phase sense, simply by the merit of your inexpensively and very affordably being able to return them to play if your opponent ultimately does manage to dispatch one of those units. And, considering just how powerful those cards can be, keeping in mind that it could have cost your opponent any number of cards and resources just to end up ultimately managing to deal that killing blow, the fact that you can quite effectively answer all of their hard work and effort by simply playing this card and bringing that unit back to play could be an immensely frustrating and aggravating experience. And even though that unit is stuck in your HQ, where it's entirely susceptible to the likes of your opponent's doom, simply considering that elite units are typically very hardy, survivable, and resilient, on top of being formidable attackers, I think that this elite is quite likely to survive being commit during the command phase alongside your warlord and arriving only to exhaust at whatever planet you happen to send your warlord to. So, hopefully during that ensuing guaranteed combat taking place wherever your warlord happens to go, hopefully they ultimately end up surviving the very first combat round, but even if they don't, you nevertheless do benefit from their sponging up and absorbing any number of enemy unit attacks or card effects, even if your opponent simply opts to play something like the Fury of Sicarius, so that they can again destroy what may very well be your most formidable unit, even if it's only costing them a single individual attacker, something maybe like a 10th Company Scout that's essentially insignificant over the course of the game. You nevertheless have to keep in mind that the number of those events they have at their disposal is quite limited, and if you get them to spend that card, then it's just one less nasty trick and surprise that you and the rest of your armed forces need worry about or concern yourself with. I definitely think it's worth considering that at the moment, given our current meta, which very much favors inexpensive, multiple army units, you're nevertheless relatively unlikely to see a large number of elite units. But if you just so happen to be one of those players that does decide to use those, then I definitely think this card is worth considering. At the very least, it does have that built-in shield value, so it's never going to be a truly dead card in your hand, and although this is really only going to be of any benefit to you most likely during the mid or late game, it nevertheless does have some pretty enormous inherent potential. So, while it's certainly possible that if your elite ends up dying during the pivotal and decisive battle of the game, and they're being returned to play at your HQ, ultimately may not make any difference if the game is going to end that round, you could simply opt to use this as a shield card, or, depending on what other cards you're running, or that we ultimately see released, you could nevertheless combine this with a number of nasty other effects in order to spring some devious surprises upon your opponent. For instance, if you're an orc player and you have the teleporta pad support in play, if you use fallback to resurrect your dead Goth Knob, it's entirely possible that, if you're fighting at the first planet, you can simply exhaust that support to transport your orc unit from your HQ to the first planet, where it arrives ready, entirely unexhausted, and with a fully replenished pool of 6 hit points. So, while I definitely acknowledge that elites certainly aren't the most common sights to see on any given battlefield, and that there very well may be several games where you draw this card only to ultimately not actually have any opportunity to play it, it nevertheless does possess some pretty significant potential, and given that our meta is always shifting, always changing, it's definitely going to be worth always considering in the back of your mind, simply because if there ever comes a point when elites are all the more favorable to play, then this event could definitely start to see a resurgence, and therefore become an all the more common deck inclusion. So, whether you bring an elite back into play and ultimately use it to devastating effect against your opponent, or you simply resurrect a unit, bring it back to your HQ, it commits alongside your warlord, and then spends the rest of the game sitting at a planet by itself, winning you neither combats nor command struggles. Both options are certainly possible, but definitely let me know in the comments what your own experiences have been with fallback, and I very much look forward, as with any other card, as we see more and more expansions, just how the popularity of this event in particular ebbs and flows with time. Last but not least, I'll just mention that I nevertheless do think that this event is a fantastic means of potentially punishing your opponent for investing heavily in various card effects simply to destroy some of your elites, like if they've spent an innumerable volume of resource tokens to superpower a Tzeentch's Firestorm to frightening and terrifyingly powerful heights, to simply opting to invest a number of resources in a global destruction type effect along the lines of Exterminatus if your unit happens to stray away from the first planet, or even a Doom if the unit happens to already be in your HQ. Or if your opponent's doing something devious like using a glorious intervention and ultimately paying for that event, giving up that valuable card, and sacrificing one of their own units, all to cancel and negate a single, albeit likely to be powerful or even overwhelming attack from your elite units, and deal it some damage in return. So, certainly a card with enormous potential. I certainly look forward to the day where deck inclusion of this card becomes all the more commonplace, and really the only other thing I can think of to mention is that if at any point your opponent forces you to sacrifice a unit, Unfortunately, seeing as how that does not count as your unit having been destroyed, it is at that point entirely ineligible to benefit from this event. But regardless, our second event, last neutral card, and final card of the core set is the zero cost No Mercy, with a single shield icon, the tactic trait, and the text Interrupt. When your opponent uses a shield card, exhaust a unique unit you control to cancel that card's shielding effect. So, definitely important to consider regarding this card is that despite counting as one of those cards you include within your deck, you nevertheless incur no resource cost when it comes to playing No Mercy. So in that case, unless your opponent has played you before, or this is a common sight to behold in your local meta, it's effectively impossible for your opponent to telegraph, and unless they're playing Nullify, it is in any case entirely impossible for your opponent to prevent. And once you cancel a single shield card, it's very important to note that your opponent does not have any opportunity to play a replacement card. So this effectively works like Armor Bane, in that if you just so happen to trigger this interrupt, your opponent is, in all likelihood, entirely unable to negate any of that incoming damage. And definitely worth noting is that this does not specify where that damage has to come from. So long as your opponent has the opportunity to shield, that is, you're dealing damage, whether it's through an attack, through area effect, which itself is a card effect, through direct damage like Tzeentch's Firestorm, or through indirect damage like from Orc Cannon or any number of others, so long as you're not moving damage that doesn't allow your opponent any shield opportunity. Anytime your opponent might opt to throw a shield card between their unit and suffering damage, you're entirely able to trigger No Mercy in order to cancel the effect of that card entirely. And definitely worth noting is that that card still counts as having been played. So, if for instance they've decided to use their Warlord's signature attachment for its powerful, at times all but insurmountable printed 3 shield icon value, you can nevertheless negate that effect entirely, and that attachment enters their discard pile, having no beneficial effect for that player whatsoever. They derive no shield benefit, and unless they can bounce that back to their hand or directly to the battlefield, it's entirely likely that you won't actually have to deal with that attachment for the remainder of the game. And, considering that you're going to want to wait to play this card until the most opportune of times, it's an absolutely fantastic means of all but assuring you'll be able to either kill one of your opponent's most durable or valuable units, or, likely to be even more beneficial, simply bloody their warlord or kill them outright. For example, if you happen to be a Chaos player, and you have a Possessed attacking your opponent's 7 HP Nosdrag, even if they attempt to play a Cyborg Body as a shield card, you cancel that shielding effect outright. They immediately take a full 9 damage, and their Warlord is instantly bloodied, exhausted, and sent packing back to their HQ. Or, in innumerable other cases, if your opponent is already bloodied and only has a paltry 5 or 6 hit points, being able to conjure up that much attack power in the mid to late game, or even early game if you've been incredibly aggressive and potentially lucky in countering and beating down your opponent's warlord, then the opportunistic employment of a No Mercy in your favor could provide a fantastic means for securing an, under normal circumstances relatively rare, victory through outright enemy warlord kill. Clearly, the obvious downside to this card is that it requires the exhaustion of a unique unit in order to play it, And, considering that we've only seen one unique unit released for each faction, unless you're quite keen on exhausting your warlord to play this card, it's, as a direct result, quite unlikely that you'll have a ready and unexhausted unique unit with abundant actions to spare so that they can be exhausted to pay for this event. But, considering just how powerful this effect could be, whether or not you incur some sort of short-term penalty, it could very well be worth exhausting your warlord or unique units if you are indeed able to dispatch a valuable enemy army, bloody their warlord, or even score a game-winning kill. So, definitely unlikely to be a card of which you want to run a great many copies in your deck, but certainly something that we see a lot of players running one of, and, although at that point this does become rather wildly inconsistent, and the frequency with which you'll ultimately draw this event and have it when you need it becomes all the less likely, considering that this is probably of most benefit during the mid to late game, you could nevertheless end up with a reasonable chance of drawing this, even if it happens to be but a single card in your deck. I think that nevertheless, this could be a fantastic means of punishing an opponent for overextending, being arrogant, or in any case overconfident, for perhaps relying on a hand full of shield cards to protect them, and considering that in the absolute best of cases, this could very well entirely negate, cancel, and overwhelm a 4 shield value card, specifically the likes of a command link drone, used with Fireblade Kyvray at that planet to attempt to mitigate incoming damage. The potential of this card is enormous, and certainly as we see more and more unique units over time, this only stands to become an all the more frequent inclusion in decks. So, while I readily acknowledge that you could very well be setting yourself up into a dangerous position by merit of exhausting your unique units, particularly your warlord, for instance, an exhausted warlord can't opt to use its combat turn to retreat, and instead has to wait until the end of a combat round to do so. If your opponent can't take opportunistic advantage of that exhaustion, then it's entirely possible you can safely deal an absolutely devastating blow to any of your enemy's units. So, given that this has a built-in shield icon, and as I could say with any such card, it's never going to be truly dead in your hand, I think that this nevertheless does have fantastic potential. Whether or not you ultimately see including any copies of this card, let alone more than one in your deck, is entirely up to you, but considering again just what a pivotal difference this can make, particularly once we start seeing more warlords from the warlord cycle of war packs that specifically focus on trying to kill and destroy the enemy warlord outright, No Mercy can certainly serve to be an absolutely fantastic card. So there are definitely going to be games where it's an absolute hit, but at the same time, there are definitely going to be just as many games, if not more, where it might just prove essentially ineffectual. So, as with any of these cards, be sure to let me know your own opinion and experience in the comments below, but considering just how rare an Armorbane type effect is within the context of the core set itself, that is, it's specifically limited to the likes of the Iandan Wraithguard and a Captain Cato Sicarius wielding the Talisarian Tempest Blade, the potential inherent to this card is enormous. And with any of the 6 different neutral cards we've covered today, be sure in the comments to let me know about your own thoughts, opinions, and actual tabletop play experience. But with that said, let's go ahead and bring this video to a close. So, As always, thank you all so much for watching. This concludes my initial series of videos covering the breadth and entirety of the core set, and up next we're on to the Warlord cycle of war packs. So, once again, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Please leave a comment with your own thoughts and opinions on these cards, any of the other non-signature faction cards of this series, and be sure to take a look at my Warlord reviews as well. So, thank you once again for watching. Feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter or Facebook, any of the social medias, as interaction and engagement with the audience is hands down the best and most rewarding aspect of running this channel. So, thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you again soon.